With the jury finding Derek Chauvin guilty of murdering George Floyd, much speculation is being made regarding Mr. Chauvin's likelihood of an appeal. To discuss why and how this could play out, I'm joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
So, Scott, my first question has to be, will Chauvin appeal? And if so, what are the likely grounds for such an appeal?
Almost certainly the answer is yes. He doesn't want to spend
between
the rest of his aware years in custody. So let's just go ahead and say yes. And so the grounds for the appeal, there are multiple possible grounds for appeals. And I've heard some Minnesota defense attorneys talk about this as well. So, you have to remember, and I don't know that you always do, Mark, is that in the United States, we're licensed to practice law as lawyers in a state or maybe a couple states, but it's not a nationwide practice. So he was convicted under state law, and he can have state and federal challenges to his conviction. In other words, the conviction has to be valid both under the complex, kind of basket of rights that a defendant has under the state rules, and also all criminal defendants in the United States have federal rules that protect them. So
what are the things that he's likely to appeal on?
Well, number one, the lack of sequestration of the jury, as was petitioned for by Eric Nelson, his defense attorney, from the outset. The kind of poisonous atmosphere that the jury was in, both in sort of a general sense, meaning the courthouse was like a fortress, and in a specific sense, meaning, did they learn about Maxine Waters' statements? Did they learn about the pig's head and blood that was sprayed on the former home of one of the defense expert witnesses? These are the things that, the sort of poisoning of the jury with respect to its lack of sequestration would be one. Also, Mark, in this sort of same universe is the decision not to move the trial. I wrote about this in LibertyNation.com. The jurors of a trial are not supposed to have a vested interest in the outcome of that trial. They're just supposed to be the fair, readers of the evidence and deciders of the fact. And in this case, if the jurors were at all apprehensive about voting not guilty, right, then they didn't have the choice to vote not guilty without worrying about whether their house was going to get vandalized or worse, or they couldn't go to the store because it was looted and burned. Well, then that's not a fair trial for Mr. Chauvin, because the jurors weren't free to decide his guilt or innocence without that hanging over their head. So those are just two that could go.
So I want to discuss briefly something you mentioned there, which is about what politicians have been saying. Specifically, you had Representative Maxine Waters, as you pointed out, demanding a guilty verdict. And at least from my layman's understanding, it sounded to me, and I'm sure this is not a legally based opinion, but that if a guilty verdict weren't delivered, that people should riot. That's how it seemed to me, as let's not say quite a disinterested onlooker.
Well, listen, we don't have to read too far between the lines to know that that's exactly what she was saying. And I just think it asks us to be willfully blind to not see that in the language. That's what Maxine Waters is about, and has been about that for a long time.
Yeah, then of course there was Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, piling on after saying that I believe it was after the jury had been put away for deliberations, saying that the evidence was overwhelming. Now, in the UK, we have some rules for both press and politicians regarding commenting on a case that's not yet concluded. How is this different in the US?
Well, I can tell you that no lawyer, and last I checked, Joe Biden, I know he plagiarized, I think, or cheated his way through law school, but I think he got the law degree eventually.
He plays one on TV.
Yeah. You are not supposed to do that, and certainly not to suggest that there is one correct verdict. As I've written and talked about on LibertyNation.com, I think that there was reasonable doubt, as I said before the jurors went in. But also, I never said, or nor would I presume that it would be ridiculous to suggest that there would be another verdict, or that somehow another verdict would be improper. It's especially, I think, irresponsible for any lawyer who hasn't seen all the evidence, meaning if they didn't literally sit and watch all of the evidence that was presented, for them to opine, I think is massively irresponsible. But this is part of the notion of our we have this dual sovereign system, Mark, where, if instead of Joe Biden saying that, it was the governor of Minnesota, for instance, that would provide much more purchase for an appeal from by Mr. Chauvin. I think that the reason why the judge didn't order a mistrial because of Maxine Waters' statements was he just thought that at the end of the day that those were unlikely to be present a barrier to the jury to kind of judge fairly, and that's part of what an appeals court will look for in evaluating how prejudicial these things were to Mr. Chauvin's chances to obtain a fair trial.
So speaking of how the appeal system actually works, does Chauvin's defense team, do they get to make the same arguments again in front of another judge, or is it another jury, or is he pushing for a whole retrial? What's happening here? How does this work?
So the first trial, is that a Freudian slip? The trial that we just saw was the prosecution making the case that he murdered George Floyd, and they defended within the context of that trial against those charges. That's not what will happen on appeal. What will happen on appeal is that they will bring the case forward that says, my client, Mr. Chauvin, was denied a fair trial, and these charges should be overturned. They'll argue that they should be overturned with prejudice, which means that he gets to they won't be reissued. That's a further reach than the grant of a new trial, which is one possible outcome. And they will have to present, Mark, evidence that the trial that Chauvin received was deficient sufficiently in one of the areas that are fundamental right, that he has a fundamental right to a fair trial, that make up one of the sort of bundle of sticks that create a fair trial, including a juror's box that's free from intimidation, and that the violation was severe enough that it should be tossed out. So there's plenty of violations. I don't even think that a person who thinks that he was convicted lawfully would suggest there were no violations by the prosecution of Chauvin's rights. The question is, do they meet the burden of requiring a new trial or getting those charges tossed out completely?
One final question, if I may, Scott. Obviously, Judge Peter Cahill, who oversaw this trial, a lot of the statements he made, would they be used by the defense to try and argue for that there should be either, as you say, a tossing out of charges or a retrial? Would Judge Cahill's statements made during the course of the trial be used to bolster that argument?
Judge Cahill's statements before the jury, if there were statements that he did make before the jury that they wanted to introduce, they could be used. But his statements outside of court that we've seen in dealing with the judges, most likely not. His rulings certainly would be. And if he made statements to support or defend those rulings, that would be relevant. But for instance, I don't know if you're thinking of what I'm thinking of, but he did say that Maxine Waters' statement might give reason for an appeals court to change the verdict or throw out the trial. That's speculation on his part about how an appeals court might act. That statement is not going to be admissible or kind of legally actionable. Okay.
Scott Cosenza, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's it for this edition of Liberty Nation TV. Remember to hit Liberty Nation News for original articles, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcast, and our signature television program, The Conservative 5. Just go to libertynation.com in your browser, or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Mark Angelides. Thanks for watching. This program is a production of libertynation.com. Conservative news, where truth matters.
Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.